There's nothing I love more than authenticity, which is why I'm so excited about Salsa de la Viuda hot sauce, which has been on kitchen tables in Mexico since 1956. It will be available here in the U.S. for purchase later this year. In addition to livening up your food, it's Mexican-owned, it's woman-owned, and it's one of the only hot sauce brands to have 100% Mexican-sourced pepper mix. Salsa de la Viuda hot sauce will be available here in the United States to purchase on shelves later this year. Hey there, I'm Lezli Levene Harvell. Welcome to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. I believe the best way to explore a topic in depth is to view it through multiple lenses. Join us as we explore race, culture, and societal issues through the lens of industry experts, writers, cultural critics, and HBCU students. Today is our fourth installment of our series called Colonialism, but Make It Sexy. We chatted about the myth of Southern hospitality, French colonialism in Southeast Asia and North Africa. Today, we're going to explore romanticizing of colonialism of Pacific Islanders. I'm really excited to chat with Tina Ngata, who is joining us from New Zealand. Tina is a Ngati Porou, author, researcher, and mother of two from the East Coast of Aotearoa, also known as New Zealand. Her work involves advocacy for environmental, Indigenous, and human rights. Thank you, Tina, so much for joining us. And can you explain Aotearoa and what that is?
Sure. Kia ora, Lezli, and thank you for the invite. Thanks for having me, and I'm excited to be here as well. So yes, Aotearoa is our Māori name for what much of the rest of the world knows as New Zealand. We have Te Ika-a-Maui, which is also called the North Island, and Te Waipoinamu, also known as the South Island. And we have some other outlying islands as well, Reekohu and Rakiura. And so collectively these days, our Māori name for the nation is Aotearoa. And the colonial name, of course, is New Zealand. We are in the very south of the South Pacific, but we share a heritage that connects us through to the Cook Islands or Tumutumu-Avaro, Tahiti, Hawaii, Samoa, Tonga. We're a part of Te Moana Nui Akua, which is also known as the Pacific Ocean Nation.
I am really excited to explore the cartoon version of colonialism. Thank you so much for establishing all of that. This is so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
What were the major European powers that essentially had their hands in the Pacific as it relates to colonialism?
England was one of the dominant European powers around the world, either directly or indirectly, and certainly that was the case in Te Moana Nui Akua as well. And then, of course, in Tahiti, Marquesas, Society Islands, you saw France as a major colonizing power. In the Philippines, you have Spain, and you also have, of course, in Hawaii and Guahan, you have the United States as a colonizing power there as well. And then even Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, I should say, the New Zealand colonial government have been colonizing powers in and of themselves for places like Nauru and Niue and Rarotonga, today known as the Cook Islands. Our governments have played colonizing roles in relation to those islands as well.
Okay. So the Pacific Islands, particularly the women from these regions, are hypersexualized, which is a narrative that we see throughout colonization. For example, Sarji Bartman, who was, and I'm using air quotes, brought from South Africa to Europe by a British doctor and given the stage name, the Hottentot Venus. I don't know if you've ever heard of her, but she was paraded around in freak shows in London and Paris, and crowds were invited to look at her butt and her genitals. Sarji Bartman died on December 29th, 1815 at 26 years old. Some reports say it was due to complications from syphilis and pneumonia, but the exhibition and the violence on her body continued even after her death. After her death, she was studied by French anatomists, zoologists, and physiologists, and her brain, her skeleton, and her sexual organs remained on display in a Paris museum until 1974. Her remains weren't repatriated to South Africa until 2002, when then President Nelson Mandela had requested that the French government return the remains of Sarji so that she could be laid to rest. And according to South African History Online, the process took 8 years as the French had to draft a carefully worded bill that would not allow other countries to claim treasures taken by the French. On March 6, 2002, Sarji was brought back home to South Africa, where she was buried on August 9th, 2002, which is Women's Day, a public holiday in South Africa. And she was buried on the Eastern Cape province, which is where she was born. As we talk about historical nostalgia, romanticizing colonialism, cultural memory, and fictional narratives of colonized people that have endured over centuries, and then you see this fiction in movies, products, theme parks, I want to delve into some of the earlier representations of when we start seeing these myths take shape. Tina, James Cook, the British explorer for whom the Cook Islands were named, kept a journal of his expeditions, of his quote-unquote findings. The Cook Islands, as we mentioned, are part of New Zealand, right?
Well, they were, yes.
Okay, so they were part of New Zealand. Can you talk about Captain Cook and his early observations of the women there?
Sure, and I'd start off just to acknowledge the tipuna wahine, the ancestor that you just spoke about, and the way in which she was treated. It's heartbreaking, and I want to acknowledge her mana, but I also want to acknowledge that is a collective experience right throughout Indigenous and Native and spaces that have been invaded, and that the desanctification of cultures and of peoples of land goes hand in hand with the colonization process. When you desanctify somebody, you are in a way justifying your ability to be able to dispossess them because they don't mean anything, right? They don't mean anything if you take away their sacredness. And of course, women through many Native cultures are considered sacred. And if you want to take away somebody's sacredness, you take away their women, their ability to be able to bring people into this world and continue their culture and their way of knowing and being and doing. And for many cultures, the women hold that sacred role. And so we are so often desanctified and targeted in the very early processes in that way. So I just wanted to acknowledge the criminality of what was done in the story that you just laid before of us, but also the solidarity that we have in that space and the enduring experience really of Indigenous women being brutalized and utilized in those ways. And certainly this is something that has happened from the very inception of imperial expansion as well. And in our experience here in Aotearoa, that includes the story of James Cook coming here and entering into our collective oceanic territory is Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, the Pacific. And his very early journal writings noted, of course, the different sexual acts or ceremonial acts that he observed. And these went back to England. And of course, this is what the European and British people really zeroed in on, the sexualized content of what he collected. One of the earliest things that happened with his writings is that they went into the brothels. And the brothels started to hold themed evenings, orgies, using the names of some of the female leaders across Te Moana Nui a Kiwa and hypersexualizing the evenings that they had.
And I just want to clarify, they're using the names of these female leaders, not because the female leaders are associated with this. This is just them saying, we're going to take this name and use this for our entertainment.
Yes, absolutely. They fetishized our sacred ceremonies. And the other part to remember of those early European and British invasions, some of the greatest population-based impacts happened through sexually transmitted diseases. So gonorrhea and syphilis that spread throughout our Moana Nui a Kiwa, throughout our ocean nation, was brought here by those same boats on the Endeavour and on the Spanish invasion vessels and the French invasion vessels. And they took out entire communities. And our own historical accounts also speak to the arrival of the flea. And when they talk about the flea, they mean sexually transmitted diseases and the way in which that interrupted our own genealogical descent as well. And in fact, I would say it probably over and above, I mean, he shot and killed and murdered many ancestors, but over and above that, the greatest population-based impact of Cook's exploits was the population loss through sexually transmitted diseases, both from Cook as well as his crew. So there are historical accounts that speak to Cook passing on sexually transmitted diseases to ancestors, to tipuna in Hawaii, as young as 15 years old they were. And many other historical accounts from other crewmen who speak of them, again, passing on sexually transmitted diseases to young girls who are preteen as well.
These girls are being raped, I'm pretty sure. If we're looking at the journals of the Europeans, they're not going to say they raped someone.
What's interesting is that Cook actually has two different versions for his, because he had three major journeys around Te Moana Nui a Kiwa. And that first journey, there are two versions of his journal. There's the original version where his accounts of what he saw happening were a lot more, I guess, blunt and frank.
Graphic.
And graphic, and then he went back and then he rewrote a second version as well. So yeah, it definitely does come up, but you do have to have a close eye for it because the journals have been rewritten and reinterpreted a few times. You have to go back to the original versions, and they've most often been reinterpreted by imperial apologists who want to create a romanticized version of invasions. Even using the word discovery rather than invasion is a form of romanticizing what happened in and of itself. And it erases the fact that we had our own territorial rights that were violated by these people coming and planting their flag and claiming the right to be able to even name these lands.
So, Tina, we began this series speaking with a British psychologist that specializes in nostalgia. And we unpacked historical nostalgia and differentiated it from personal nostalgia. The latter is an emotion that often brings people back to a time of their early childhood or adolescence, and it's something that they have personally experienced. On the other hand, historical nostalgia is about having an affection for a time that one hasn't personally experienced. They experience this time through a book or a movie or sometimes stories told by a family member. She said that sometimes people only need one book or one movie or one film to make that cultural imprint on them. And she said it's a very powerful marketing tool. So, Tina, the white imagination of who Pacific Islanders are is linking the past, as we've talked about James Cook, to the present. And so, for example, Gone with the Wind is a very emblematic cultural product or artifact that really boosted the romanticizing of the antebellum South. Can you tell me what that analogous cultural artifact or cultural artifacts are for the Pacific Islands?
The hypersexualized and fetishized ideas around women, it really hit a new kind of hyperspeed, if you will, through World War II. And the intense kind of militarization of the Pacific. If you have a look at for instance, militarism in Okinawa, and that has resulted in a particular fetishizing of geisha culture, a particular fetishizing of the women around Okinawa, and that's also connected to a wide range of sexual assault cases associated with the military camps there. And then similarly, in Hawaii as well, you see the R&R culture, the rest and recreation culture that was established through World War II, meant that the servicemen there, when they went on R&R break, would often drink heavily, would womanize. They had these activities that they would engage in. There were high numbers of sexual assaults associated with R&R in the Pacific Islands as well. And then when they went back home to the United States after serving their time, they had their own sense of nostalgia about those times, and they created Tiki lounge culture. And so we started to see the Tiki lounges where people would drink their cocktails out of the heads of Pacific carvings, and they would hang lei around everybody and play this really kitschy Pacific music and have these kitschy grass skirts and the coconut pare or bras, or however you would term them.
before you go further, who is Tiki?
They use this term Tiki Lounge. They've taken from the term Tiki, which in the Pacific, for us, Tiki is an ancestor god. So we descend down from Tiki, and he also exists in the god realm as the first. Well, there's slight differences depending on who you're talking to, which island you're speaking to, which nation you're speaking with. But in our narratives, he was the first infant born of Hine Te Iwa Iwa, who was our goddess of childbirth and the chin tattoo and moko and the female arts and the moon cycles. Her first child was Tiki. He's representative of the descent of humankind onto Earth, and one of our most prized emblems that we wear is a Tiki necklace. And so we revere Tiki. We have emblems and carvings that relate to Tiki. And then what we've seen over time is that has been commodified and co-opted into a range of popular culture. And so Tiki Lounge took the colonial observations of our sacred carvings and then co-opted them into drinks, into this fetishized idea of a god, and used it for the creation of Tiki Lounge culture, which is desanctifying of our traditional sacred culture.
More impolite conversation in just a moment. The new HBO documentary Yusuf Hawkins' Storm Over Brooklyn tells the story of Yusuf Hawkins, a black teenager who was murdered in 1989 by a group of young white men in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. His death and the official response to it sparked outrage in New York. The film, directed by Muta Ali Muhammad, explores the 30-year legacy of Yusuf's murder, and his family and friends reflect on the tragedy and the subsequent fight for justice that inspired and divided New York City. Stream it now on HBO Max. Visit hbomax.com to sign up for your 7-day free trial. Thinking about the military and the romanticizing of that, one of the things we talked about were Elvis movies. I thought that was really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about how you think that made a cultural imprint in terms of how the West sees that relationship between colonialism, which then became militarism, and the way it's seen right now?
Sure. My research and my thesis is around colonial fictions and the way in which the fictions that are created by colonizers serve to uphold a structure of colonial domination. And some of those fictions are that colonialism was sexy, that colonialism was invited, that we wanted to be colonized, that the women wanted the colonial men to come and rescue us, and that we were generally willing to be taken and utilized, and that this, had an overall benefit for us because we were a savage race. These are fictions that help to create a space of comfort, and it helps people to evade their own enduring complicitness in a state of injustice as well, and evade the truth. The way in which this is played out in the Pacific is that we have been portrayed as a place that you escape to, an idyllic space, as an escape route for colonizers who stay in other spaces. And people don't consider issues to do with climate change or rising sea levels, polluted waters, polluted food systems, climate-related severe storm systems, all of the kind of injustice that is visited upon places like the Pacific. Those are not welcome as topics to talk about because it impacts upon this idea of the idyllic escape, which is really an imposition of the colonial idea of where we're from, as opposed to this is our home, this is where we live. We don't have anywhere else to escape to. You see it coming up in places like the way in which the islands are represented in the Elvis movies, and the women are seen as promiscuous and inviting and waiting to be rescued and demure. A common trope is the dusky South Pacific maiden. We also see it in the comic books of the time, and a lot of that comes back to these ideas of the fact that we are sexually inviting.
Thank you for sending those pictures of the covers of the comic books. I was not ready for that. I was like, wow. Can you describe them really quickly?
A lot of the comic books of those times from the Second World War and then post-Second World War, going into the times of Elvis, the 50s and the 60s and whatnot. There are a whole range of comic books called the South Sea Tales, are some of the most famous ones. And they're generally along the themes of the dusky Pacific maiden who's reclining, who's very scantily clad and is waiting for somebody to save her from her own people. And it's always a colonizer that needs to come and save her from her own people, who are always portrayed as ugly.
One of the ones you sent me, the woman isn't reclining. She's actually being held by a white man. And she's kind of like, oh my God, like, you know, she's draped. They're getting on a boat and they're trying to save her. And it says something like the Fiji Amazons. And I'm like, this is crazy. You know, it's interesting as it relates to the Elvis movies, because I had never seen any of them. Blue Hawaii was the first of 3 Elvis movies made in Hawaii. It opened at number 2 in the box office for that week and finished as the 10th top grossing film of 1961. And the other 2 were called Paradise and Girls. So what I think is really interesting is that I think that the Elvis movies continue to be the framework for how Hollywood still views. Okay, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what I found about Blue Hawaii. This is the plot. Having been released from the Army, Chadwick Gates, Elvis Presley, is eager to return to Hawaii with his surfboard, his beach friends, and his girlfriend. His mother, who's played by Angela Lansbury, wants him to follow in his father's footsteps and take over management at the Great Southern Hawaiian Fruit Company, the family business. Okay, so I didn't see Aloha either, but it's a 2015 film starring Bradley Cooper and Emma Stone. You're laughing. You already know. Okay, but listen to the plots and think about the plot of Blue Hawaii that I've just read. Okay. While on assignment in Oahu, Hawaii, military contractor, who's played by Bradley Cooper, reconnects with his old flame, who is Rachel McAdams, now married to an Air Force recruit. He also spends time with Emma Stone's character, who has an Asian last name, which I think is interesting because Emma Stone is not Asian, as far as I know. But you see the same military theme with white people centered on Hawaii, with the name of the movie as it's a native Hawaiian term. And I don't see any Pacific Islanders in the main cast. So not much has changed in terms of Hollywood's approach since the 1960s. Just even thinking about the idea that they would name it Aloha, it's like having a movie with a Swahili word in it. Like if a movie was named Jambo or something like that. And it's just like a whole white cast. I thought it was really interesting when you brought up how those Elvis movies really made that cultural imprint. How does this escape from the real world, romanticized view of colonialism, of U.S. militarism in the Pacific Islands, and people going to Pacific Islands to try to recreate this fantasy, how does this impact the people there?
We definitely stand in solidarity with our Hawaii cousins in relation to their ongoing, enduring experience of militarism on their lands. The idea of aloha, the way in which aloha was used in the film that you're referring to, it's super offensive, because similarly to the way in which I described our ancestor Tiki, the idea and concept of, in our culture, aroha, which is aloha in Hawaii, is a sacred concept, and the way in which it gets interpreted and commodified. So, you know, you come here and you'll see aroha splayed on prawn farm names and names of soap and names of perfume. And similarly, you go to Hawaii and you see the same thing. Aloha burger, aloha this, aloha that. And the term itself is a overarching principle for how we engage with each other and how we engage with the land and how we shape and our view of the universe. And so when that gets taken and commodified and cheapened, it is another device of the colonial machine to diminish who we are, to justify dispossessing us. And, you know, that looks different all the way around Te Moana Nui Akiwa, in Guahan, and in Tahiti it has its own manifestation, and here in Aotearoa it has its manifestation. In Hawaii, particularly in Blue Hawaii, that they have the trifecta really of tourism, food industry, and militarism. And those three sectors operate in a really particular way in the Hawaiian context to keep Indigenous people off the land and to cheapen and commodify them. So the tourism industry works to commodify and cheapen, for instance, hula and the idea of aloha, and commodify them and make them consumable and desanctify them. And it helps to move them off the land. And they move them off the land so that they can move military bases onto the land, because Hawaii is a very strategic space in the middle of the Pacific between the Asian continent and the American continent. And then the other thing that they do is that they use the lands of Hawaii for food systems as well. Monsanto, for example, has huge land holdings in Hawaii as well, and also price them out of being able to stay where they are. So, for instance, where the Disney resort is in Hawaii has gentrified the local area, and the native people whose land that is are not able to afford to live in the neighboring areas around there.
And the paradox of that is that the resort is designed to be emblematic of what Disney thinks is Hawaiian Indigenous culture.
And then there are other, not just Disney, but there are other theme parks. So, Universal Studios has a theme park, Volcano Bay, that again relies upon these tropes of the large tiki carvings and the quite insulting ways in which they try to represent our language, but they miss, and it just sounds gubuga kind of ways of speaking. And so they'll primitivize us in their representations and romanticize us in there. But when it comes to speaking about the very real issues that we face, which is like rising sea levels and ocean plastic pollution and climate change, it interrupts the colonial ideal of what the Pacific is.
Which are supposed to be grass skirts and drinking out of a god's head. Is there anything that I have not brought up that you think is ubiquitous in popular culture that is really a romanticized or even erasure of Indigenous people in the Pacific Islands that we've come to think is something normal because of the way it's been represented over time?
I guess that we've spoken a fair bit about our Hawaii cousins, and there's a concept called the lovely hula hands, which is an essay that was written by Honani K. Trask around the way in which the sacred practice of hula has been commodified, and it's also come to create a stereotype, particularly around women in Hawaii. The equivalent of that in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is the way in which people perceive the notion of haka as well. And so haka is something that many people might be aware of, especially through our sports, and I know it's carried over to US football practices where you see people engaging in haka. And actually, The Rock has done it quite a bit as well, has tried to introduce haka into some of his films. The way in which they are communicated is often an oversimplification of a deeply sacred practice. And the way in which these practices have been used, they can be used to cast us as the warrior people. And there are even researchers who have tried to isolate the warrior gene. And it's a deeply offensive approach to us. It usually connects to trying to justify why we need to be colonized, why we need to be civilized. It's usually connected also to hyper-incarceration of our people, because the inference behind it is that in our most natural state, we are violent and we are warriors. It completely erases the fact that we were scientists, that we were navigators, that we were crossing the seas before Europeans knew that the Pacific existed. We were crisscrossing it, that we have this incredibly advanced understanding of the celestial realm, of the star systems and the planets around us, and that we had these incredible advanced food systems that could feed hundreds of thousands of people in a regenerative fashion, exactly the types of understandings and science that actually the world needs right now in response to a lot of the environmental and ecological crises that we're facing. These ideas around the haka, they've also been used to justify taking our children out of our homes. So if you're Māori, you're more likely to be incarcerated more than any other race. 60% of the prison population in Aotearoa are Māori women, even though we only account for 15% of the population, 60%. So we have the most incarcerated female population in the world of any ethnicity. 75% of youth in the prison are Māori, even though we only account for 15% of the New Zealand population. You are way more likely to be pulled up, to be arrested, and then if you are arrested, you're way more likely to be incarcerated on your first offence if you are Māori than any other ethnicity in Aotearoa. And you see these very similar rates in also Canada and the United States in regions that have high Indigenous populations, very similar rates of what we call the child theft, which is the colonial name being state care, but the child theft to prison pipeline, where children are uplifted and taken out of homes. The justification is usually because you're bad parents, and the bad parent is rooted in these ideas of savagery. And all of this is upheld by the colonial fiction of us as savages, and that is fed into by the warrior trope that is hyper-commodified through people focusing on haka as a war dance. Haka is not even exclusively a war dance, I should say. We use it to welcome people. We use it to celebrate people. And there are thousands of different forms of haka. And women can do them and men can do them. But it's very specific and there are protocols around it. We use it for all different kinds of reasons. But it's been zeroed in on as a war dance because that helps to try and instill fear in people and galvanize this idea that we are savage and that we require colonization as well to help justify it.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I think about how people say that the civil rights legislation that was passed in the 1960s had a ripple effect on colonized people in other parts of the world. I'm curious, with the Black Lives Matter awakening of 2020, has there been any sort of halo effect in your area?
Yeah, I should say we had Black Lives Matter marches here in Aotearoa, in Auckland and Wellington and Dunedin. Thousands showed up for them. And they were led by our African migrant communities, particularly the youth. And they did a fantastic, and we stood in solidarity with them. And we also recognized that there is a history that has many intersections between these movements that goes back to the civil rights, and even the civil rights movement definitely had ripples that reached the shores of Aotearoa. We had the Pacific Panthers movement that was a response to the Black Panthers movement. We had certainly our resistance movements go back as long as the colonizers have been here, but it provided another form of solidarity with us in calling out colonizers, and it helped to give us a bit of fuel also. So when we saw the civil rights movement playing out, that really inspired a lot of our leaders to continue in acts of civil disobedience, to march, to call for our rights in response to our colonial occupiers as well. And then that was all a part of a larger movement that resulted in the Treaty of Waitangi Act. There was a piece of legislation that has shaped our entire country since then. It created a space for really acknowledging the treaty under which the colonizers arrived here and the way in which our nation played out after that. More recently, with the Black Lives Matter movement, in my town, just in my region, there were, at around about the same time as the marches were going on, they were trying to re-erect these memorials to the Endeavour, to James Cook's vessel in our township. And y'all
were like, no, not today.
Yeah, not going to happen. And so we protested at council and we told council exactly how we felt about it. And so they had to step back on that entire process. And then the other part of that was that we called upon council to initiate an anti-racism process that assesses all of our local policy and all future policy with an anti-racism lens to make sure that whatever policy comes out of our local government does not result in further racialized disparities in our region, which our council, under the foreboding gaze of all of our marchers and our local people, agreed to. And so we had our first meeting for that 2 weeks ago, and we're starting the process of looking at anti-racism and local legislation, which has a connection back to, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement and much of what has been happening over in the United States. Yeah, so definitely there are ripples and impacts right around the world, and certainly here in Aotearoa as well.
I love to hear that. Tina, thank you so much. This has been such a rich, informative conversation. I hope you enjoyed it too. This is my last question, and it's a fun one. It's your last night on Earth. Where are you eating?
Oh, no, easy. I'm eating at my marae, in my sacred gathering house with my ancestors that have always been here for thousands of years, and the carvings around me, surrounded with my family, looking out at our waters under our mountain.
Tell me what you're eating. What's on your plate?
Oh, I'll be eating my favorite food, which is paua abalone, I think it's called to other people, abalone, which is like the steak of the sea. It's a delicacy for our people. And I'll be eating our local seaweed delicacy, paringo. I'll be eating the food of my ancestors and sharing that with my children and my family.
Thank you for listening to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Icon Dinner and on the Iconoclast Dinner Experience Facebook page. Let us know what you thought about this episode. Hit us on socials or send us feedback at press@iconoclastdinner.com. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to our podcast, and we'd also love it if you rated and reviewed us.